Hello, everybody. I think we're ready to begin. Can you hear me? I'm going to try to keep my comments on the three presentations to a minimum so that we can have more time for discussion. We're shooting for Carl's 30 minutes of discussion before we break for lunch, and the presentation at lunch we're all looking forward to. I'd like to, again, express my thanks to Drs. Hampton and Anderson and Zellico. And once again, I'd like to in particular thank Dr. Anderson, who came here at extremely short notice to prepare and present a summary of John's paper. I've been in contact with John, and he's an old friend from the times we were on the State Department policy planning staff. And he is authentically crestfallen that he was unable to be here today. For those of you who haven't read the papers presented, I urge you to do so. And I really mean it. They're available on our website. And some of my comments will move a little bit beyond the presentations and raise subjects that were touched on in the papers themselves. I hope this is further incentive for you to go home immediately and download these papers. And I'll also comment a little bit on Dr. Zellico's excellent presentation. All of the presentations are first rate in their own right, but what struck me was the extent to which they complemented one another. Dr. Eikenberry's paper tended to focus on the events leading up to reunification of Germany. Dr. Hampton's discusses that, but also discusses extensively developments in German and European foreign policy since unification. Dr. Zellick, a bit like Eikenberry, focuses on the events leading up to reunification. What's interesting, though, is the extent to which all three of the presentations stress the extent to which institutions, notably NATO and the EU, profoundly shaped European diplomacy both before and after unification. Although all three of our presenters came to the issue of institutions from a very slightly different and interesting angle. Eikenberry, focuses on the extent to which these institutions represent the efforts of individual states to achieve collective action through formal systems of consultation and reassurance and consensus building. In his discussion, and also in the discussion last night, we learned that institutions like the EU and NATO provide mechanisms through which differences can be mediated and the power of individual states constrained and commitments guaranteed. And interestingly and importantly, as Eikenberry notices, these institutions are not just important to the member states, but to outside parties with which member states are involved in negotiations. Thus, Chancellor Kohl's commitment to further European integration not only reassured President Mitterrand and Prime Minister Thatcher, but also diminished fears in Moscow of a more powerful unified Germany. I think, although it's not quite captured in her presentation, Dr. Hampton focuses more on the extent to which these institutions interplay with domestic opinion and what she calls security culture in her paper. And both, in turn, are deeply grounded in European and especially German history. I think, if I'm reading it right, Dr. Hampton, important issues of identity, though historically shaped by institutions, also transcend them. That is to say, the EU is not just a complex apparatus of interstate decision-making. It also embodies an idea, an ideal, and conceptions of collective and personal identity. Moreover, profound differences in security culture, perhaps something that you can address at some point, notably between the United States and Western Europe, especially Germany, drive how member states approach institutions like NATO. Dr. Zellico gave a very broad and fascinating overview of the various factors related to German unification, but he too stressed the importance of institutions, although also added his own particular and very interesting perspective, which was two things, one of which was the extent to which individual personalities or individuals helped drive events through those institutions. The two most interesting cases, I think, were Mikhail Gorbachev and President Bush. And I might note what was particularly fascinating is this discussion of how conceptions can be wrong. In other words, that when people go into a process and it yields a certain outcome, it is by no means clear that the outcome is truly what the individuals and the parties wanted. The other thing I think Dr. Zelikow stressed, and I think it's an important matter, is the issue of strategic initiative, which could be construed as very similar to the military concept of grand tactics. But the three of them together, I believe, while stressing very, very similar points, particularly in terms of institution, remind us how incredibly complex and in many ways path-dependent events like German unification can be. Now, Eikenberry reminds or tells us that what happened was not just the end of the Cold War, but a settlement. I think it's a very, very important concept and one that we would all bear in mind. But Dr. Hampton reminds us, too, that settlements, though profoundly important in creating stable frameworks for interstate relations, do not themselves determine the course those relations will take over time. In other words, the Cold War may have ended, but history did not. As she points out, 20 years after unification, Germany, like the EU, is still in many ways groping its way toward a fully post-Cold War foreign policy. Now, I'll throw out a couple ideas for discussion, but please don't feel constrained by these. One area is Russia. And this was mentioned by I think all three of our presenters in one way or the other. You know, Russia has not fully or formally repudiated the post-Cold War settlement, but it's pretty clear that there are many in the Russian elite, among the Russian elites and among the Russian general population, who feel ill-used by that settlement, rightly or wrongly. This resentment has only been increased by Western efforts, notably NATO expansion, that are perceived to further reduce Russia's great power status. Dr. Hampton notes that, I love the word, by the way, and it's a perfect word. Dr. Hampton notes that Russian foreign policy has flummoxed EU and NATO members, I think an absolutely right term. So my thought we could perhaps discuss is to what extent has the Russian relationship with Europe remained the great unfulfilled promise of the post-Cold War settlement. Another issue is this. Eikenberry's analysis, for all of its emphasis on institution, still reflects a very state-centered conception of international affairs. Hampton, although she only discussed it briefly in this presentation, emphasizes the role of what you'd call cultural issues now confronting Europe and Germany. These have to do with Europe and Germany's position vis-a-vis the East, let us say, and the East in this case, basically the Muslim world, looking out, and their Muslim citizens looking in. These questions of migration and assimilation are in some ways painful for states because so much of it is supranational and so much of it is subnational. Assimilation occurs at the local level, community level. And migration isn't just not a singular phenomenon that one country endures. It's migrations that go around the world are parts of vast movements of people, truly vast movements of people. And I wonder the extent to which European and German institutions, and clearly this is an issue for all European countries, including Great Britain and France, to what extent are in this instance, are we finding institutions really not suitable for dealing with these issues or these sort of cultural matters. Anyway, those are just a couple of questions that popped into my mind.
Before we move to answers to those and other questions, I want to point out we'll let them address Joe's remarks, and then I'll open it up and try to orchestrate whatever questions you might have. So, would you care to respond?
Sure. I mean, first of all, I'm very appreciative because you really did draw out some more of the paper that I felt under time constraints to sort of leave out. I mean, the paper sort of ends, and therefore you'll understand the title, which if you heard my talk, you're thinking, why is this title here? Between Euroland and Abendland. And the Abendland part of it is exactly what Joe was talking about at the end. There are issues today in Europe. They were there at the time of unification, but they were very marginalized. So today it is part of the European puzzle. It is part of European culture. It is a necessity for European institutions to deal with these cultural issues that have emerged clearly over the last decade or so. And that is the issue of who is Europe? Yes. Who is European? Who can we let in as European? Can we let the Turks in? Now, you've seen German leadership go back and forth on this. Under the Schroeder government, they were openly for Turkish accession to the EU. The Merkel administration has been officially saying no. Now, she has not been forceful in that, but there are public utterances from the Merkel administration saying essentially Turkey really shouldn't be let into EU at this time. So this is a huge domestic policy issue. It is a huge foreign policy issue. It is a huge institutional issue for Europe. Because, if you look at most of the works that talk about this issue and the EU, there really is not a good EU frame for this issue at this time. So this is what happened after the unification story. But you can see that the unification process, here's one of those emerging issues afterward that settlement isn't very good at resolving. And I think that's really critical today for Germany and for Europe. But I also appreciate you talking about, yes, that culture and institutions are very important to look at. So that if you look at German culture in NATO, it's still a very different security culture than the United States in NATO. And this comes to a head in Operation Allied Force. For Germans, it was very, very, very difficult to cross what Joschka Fischer called the Rubicon, to go from, a war-avoiding culture to a culture now that's being asked to militarily intervene abroad in the name of being in democratic concert with its allies. The Germans did that in Kosovo, and they did it well. But the lessons of Kosovo are not quite the lessons for Germany that they are for the U.S. And so as you sort of follow the lessons of Kosovo into the turn of the millennium, you see those cultural differences coming out much more and representing themselves in the institutions, as in NATO and in the European Union. So I think maybe I should stop there. And
before we move on, with Professor Zelikow, is there anything you wanted to respond to Joe's remarks?
Well, the issue of Russia and the post-Cold War settlement and some of the issues about how the Germans have adjusted after unification does probably make just one point about national identity. You have a huge settlement. Borders have changed. As borders change, basically countries are redefining who they are. Who is our community? So national identity is a nice kind of jargony phrase, but what it really means, the answer, people in a community ask themselves, who are we? Kind of what are we about? What does my community have in common? So, and it's worth an extra word or two on the German problem there and the Russian problem there. The German issue, one reason I never use the term reunification. I quote it when other people have used it to quote it accurately, but the guy knows the conference does not say reunification, and I never do, because the Germany of 1937 was not reunified. And the difference is really important. The Germany of 1937 was a Germany that was mainly created that was driven by the Kingdom of Prussia. And the Kingdom of Prussia was the core of the German Empire that then turned into the Germany of 1937. If you study the map of the historic Kingdom of Prussia of 1870 and the map of Germany today, you'll observe that most of what was the Kingdom of Prussia ain't German anymore. If you think this is the creation of a new Germany, not only that's superficially the case in the sense of the borders are really quite different, but it's organically the case instead of a kind of a Prussian motor. If you think, where is the real engine, where is the cultural heart of the Federal Republic of Germany? Probably much more like the Rhineland. With all that implies for a European identity and the commitment to the European ideal and a lot of other things. And now let's think about the Russian case. You have a Russia now that is back at the borders that it knew in the time of Peter the Great. This is, essentially back to the borders that it had 250 to 300 years ago. They're going to be sore about that. But if you think, then what's the challenge for Russia? When Russia first began to become a modern state, as it became an empire in the late 19th century, there was a huge outbreak of Russophilia to try to define a Russian national identity, especially under people like Tsar Alexander III. And then that turned into a new notion of identity, as basically we're the new Rome in a different way. We're the center, we're the leader of the world communist revolution, the center of a fraternal body of socialist republics, and so on. What is their identity now as Russia? They're no longer the heartland of a great empire inspired by, and so on. And what I see, for example, in Putin strikes me as, above all, he's not, by no means is Putin like old communist leaders. To me, Putin is as if you had crossed Tsar Alexander III and Benito Mussolini.
Don't pull your punches now.
In a good way.
So I know I'm.
You really want to tell us what you really think?
I'm courting a grave risk here that an anonymous NFSB agent who's been assigned to this particular conference will make sure that I never get a visa to visit Russia again. But think about the dilemma they have in who we are and what we're about in our community. I mean, Ed Jaregian during the break asked me a really smart question. He said, well, what about that idea of Russia and NATO? Why didn't that work out? And we talked about it, and I think we kind of came to a conclusion. It's partly because the Russians were a little bit ambivalent about whether they wanted to become part of a larger community that didn't center on them, or wanted to somehow revive some other notion of identity in which they remained at the center, and unable to resolve that ambivalence, never really seized the opening when it was there, and now they're in this different place. And so the problem of, there are a lot of things maybe the West could have done differently in order to manage Russian insecurities and assuage their sense of grievance. But I wouldn't put too much of a premium thinking that we're the key variable in the way Russia behaves. Russia is the key variable in how Russia behaves. And above all, Russian leaders are. And the way Russian leaders are trying to answer these profound questions about who are we and where we're going. And until they find some sense of security and confidence that provides them to give an effective answer to their population, they're going to exhibit various pathologies for which we should not blame ourselves too much.
Herr Mekel, registered a question here. I'll start with him.
I think Russia is such an important point that is needed in another conference to deal with that. And that's why I would like to come back to the time of the unification. At first, I would like to give a short story about describing the situation, what Mr. Zelikov mentioned in his speech about the fast process. I really think that, and you mentioned that the population in East Germany was one important factor of fastening that process. And I can give you an example for that. That's the situation on the 17th of June in the Volkskammer, the East German parliament. We had that day in the parliament two draft motions. both from different sides. On the one hand, from the conservative side, DSU, and on the other hand, from Wolfgang Ullmann from the left, together with her. Not at that point. Asking for immediate unification, taking the Article 2003, 23, and using it for that day. And that meant before finalizing 2+4. This was clear if there had been a vote for that. It would be a majority. And the question was how to prevent that there will be a vote about that. This only was a question, and it was managed, but by tricky way. And I can tell you that exactly this is an example. What if everybody is saying that the government, that political leaders made the process? What had been happened if, imagine it, if the Volkskammer that day, the 17th of June, would have this decision to use the Article 23 from that day, because that kind of article was an article which is immediately in fact. And then now two states would have to negotiate, but only one German state had to manage it backwards. How to deal with that. Only to give you that example, it is not so that all that was clear, that it is could be managed in step-by-step way. This is only one short story to give a picture about what you mentioned. But then I have two questions. One question is, Mr. Zilikov, do you really think that you mentioned the relationship between Kohl and Bush as the main point, the trust? I would like to ask you, imagine that in that time, not Kohl, but for instance Helmut Schmidt had been the chancellor. My thesis would be, there's no real change. In my view, no real change. Kohl managed it in his way, and he used, on the other hand, that process of German unification in the same time as a marvelous election campaign, and he succeeded with that. But if you see the concrete steps and the question of trust, in my view, latest with Brandt, but especially Schmidt and Kohl, it had been the same if the framework, if it happened in that time. That would be my thesis. It is not only the question personality, the special personality of Kohl, but it was more the general relationship between such kind of top politicians in Germany as Chancellor as we had, a very different one. But if you see in concrete, I think it had been done in this similar way.
But not
That's my thesis. But the second question is, what do you think, and in the question what happened, in the German story about unification, usually it is said and written that the main breakthrough to bring Gorbachev to that point to accept NATO membership was Caucasus. My impression is that in your book, it's more the meeting between Bush and Gorbachev in the end of May, but that was not really understood by the Western Germany government. Can you tell us a little bit about both the relationship of the end of May and Caucasus, because we have here different tradition. The American from your book is saying the end of May was the main breakthrough, and the German is to make strong and a big Helmut Kohl to make clear Caucasus was done by Mr. Kohl. Can you answer the question?
I'll try to be concise. I think I like your hypothesis in question one. I think you may be right. I was trying to just imagine it. Schmidt would have been more intellectual, more prickly. He would have been almost a little too smart, but the basic direction in many ways would have been the same. Charles Pohl, I had very little. I've had no personal contact with Schmidt. I know him only from books. Charles or anyone else who actually dealt directly with him might have a better just feel for that on that Fingerspitzengefühl for that issue. On the Caucasus versus Washington, I'm not trying to so much claim, if you look at the evidence on this, especially let's say from the Russians, they tend to talk a lot about Washington as having been a key moment. I think perhaps Minister Shevardnadze even did last night, if my memory of that is right. But I don't think that this, because what it really is, it's a situation in which in Washington the ice broke, but nothing was consolidated. But you felt the ice had broken. And then after Washington, there's this kind of uncertain period in which there's a reaction to that, and Shevardnadze is backtracking a little bit, and then really the challenge then was, once the ice had broken and the situation is fluid, to try to seize this and drive through the hole and consolidate the game. That's where you get the impetus to use the NATO summit to really then help drive a message home that can help consolidate the game. Also, from Gorbachev's perspective, he has a difficult problem to manage his party Congress back home. The timing for him of making the move before the party Congress, impossible. But I still by saying that, I don't think Gorbachev had I don't want to say Gorbachev had it all mapped out in May. I think, frankly, as the analogy I use in the book, it's like the jeweler who tries different ways at tapping at the diamond, and then after a while finds all of a sudden he strikes it at one particular point and the rock splits perfectly. We had that sense that somehow we'd finally just tapped just the right way and the rock split. And then the job was to try to figure out a way to consolidate the gain and do a lot of different things, and then let coal go to the Caucasus and gather in the harvest.
Could I just add? I just want to add one thing to the personality comment, because I agree that if it's Schmidt and everything else held the same, that's true. But I also think it's the dynamics of the relationship that's important too, so that if you imagine Schmidt and Carter at this moment, I think you could end up with a very different process, given their relationship.
Yeah.
So if you put a different person in Washington, not just in Bonn, then I think you potentially have a different process. Or Schroeder and Bush, the other Bush.
Ambassador Judin, you had
Bronson Reagan is next.
Yeah.
the ambassador had raised his hand about a question.
Just a comment, my own professional deformation on the Middle East, but I'm really drawn to the concept of Euroland and the Third Rome in Russia, but the role of Russia. I was at a conference about a year ago with Henry Kissinger's, and someone asked him the question, when you first met Putin, what was his major concern? And I think, according to Kissinger, the response was quite telling. He said, my greatest concern is the vulnerability of Russia's borders on the south to Islamic radicalism, to ethnic nationalism, and to the possible dismemberment of the Russian Federation by this threat. And the only reason I'm raising that is that much of our conversation is, rightfully so, Eurocentric, NATO, and the concept of Euroland and the Third Rome. But let us not forget that if you're sitting in Moscow, whether you're Putin or Medvedev or whoever is the ruler, that whatever strategic decisions they're going to make, they have to put into their calculus what they perceive as a real vulnerability in their southern borders.
President Leibel, you
I would like to ask a question to Professor Zeliko.
It's basically an empirical question, but it's connected to an observation I believe to have made listening to your talk and listening to what we heard yesterday. There's a certain contradiction between what you were at least indirectly alluding to and what was yesterday night was quite clearly said, which is that after November the 9th, one, if not the main concern of the British, of the French, and also of the Americans was that what happened in Germany and East Germany could weaken the position of Gorbachev and could potentially destabilize too quickly the Soviet empire, or maybe even the Soviet system itself. And when I heard you this morning in this part on your, I think it was your fifth question. So why did it happen so swiftly and so quickly? So you use the language almost in military terms. You were talking about outmaneuvering them and keeping the initiative and so. And the empirical question is, did you have you in the State Department or in the White House during that period, in May, June, July 1990, sort of an inkling that you would play brinkmanship on Gorbachev's expenses? Ultimately?
Yes. No, it's quite serious. The question's very good. This was a high-risk play. It was to try to push this in a way that we could advance our interests decisively. I was working for the United States of America, and I wanted to advance my country's interests. I thought that actually our conceit, it's not an unusual American conceit, is that our country's interests were substantially identical with what was better for the world. But I recognize that as a conceit. Common enough. The point is then we wanted to try to get this done, and then there's the risk you cite. There are actually a couple of different risks. There was a risk that he gets overthrown, and then there's a decisive counterreaction. There are a whole other number of things that could have gone wrong. We identified at various points a number of moves the Soviets could make that would have caused us huge trouble. I allude to some of them briefly in my book, but this is not determining. We could see if we were in their shoes, we could see the plays that we would make. And so we were, again, trying to keep this on the hop so that they could not only develop the moves, but then rally, mobilize the support to really put this forward in a decisive way. There were even ways they could have exploited the momentum of unification to actually hit us on the NATO issue. There were a lot of plays they had. But the basic argument is we thought court very high short-term risks now in order to get this to a place that will actually be much less risky for the long term. But it could have gone very badly wrong. I wrote in the book at one point. Condi Rice wrote a note in December of '89. When we decided to really hit the gas pedal and working with Bond, she said, I think I'm right, and I'll go to church and pray that I'm right. The one metaphor that I've used in something else that I'm writing is the metaphor of the sailor who is approaching a harbor. There's a relatively narrow channel with menacing through to the harbor with menacing rocks on either side. Storm clouds are gathering. The sea is getting really rough. Your options are to just kind of go put out to sea and wait for the storms to clear and approach the harbor later, or to go find some other harbor. And what you have in a way is the Americans and Bush seeing those lights of that glittering harbor and decide basically to shoot the channel and hope they can get through before the storm gets too rough and pushes them onto the rocks. Because they think if they can get to that harbor, that's a safe harbor. These institutions, these basic models we believed in, we thought would be a highly durable settlement for the long haul and for a new international order. But it required you to court some fairly high short-term risks in order to try to get there so rapidly. But I think if we'd done this in a much more deliberate way, If you work through what was happening in the Soviet Union and where that was going, I think actually a number of the substantive outcomes change in ways that I think might have been really perhaps quite tragic.
Okay, well, I have also a question to Professor Selikov with respect to his point 4, or question 4, the why question. The question, I mean, why did the US push so rapidly to the change? So that was, and then the answers were quite interesting because they largely pertain to the state of mind of President Bush and the relationship of President Bush to his advisors. He said there was a split advisors. There was split among the advisors, so that there was no clear-cut answer to that. So, in other words, there were more psychological reasons which you gave, and although I think this is certainly valuable, I would suggest that we make a distinction between the two states of minds which push people, which determine people's behavior. Namely, there's passion, interest, and reason. And the arguments which you gave were about passion and reason, but there was nothing about interest. And I wonder whether there were not some strategic long-term interests of the United States to further German unification. Not least because there was also this famous term which was coined by President Bush, namely the New World Order. So I think he had a vision of the world as they emerge or seem to emerge after the collapse of the war. And I wonder whether we should know more about the strategic interest of the United States with respect to Europe and to, in particular, of course, to Germany, rather than just knowing something about his state of mind with respect of his friendship to coal and all these issues, which of course were quite interesting and important. I'm sure of that, but still, I don't think that's the whole answer. I wonder whether you could give some additional reasons for this rapidness of the U.S. administration.
I think you read my remarks very well. I can conjure an interest story. One always can. You tell me. You tell me which position you favor. And frankly, the people on all sides of this issue could make an interest argument. As I used to say, when I used to be a trial lawyer, I used to say, I can argue this round or I can argue it flat. And for example, I could make a very good argument why it's in America's interest to keep Germany divided and Europe relatively weak. Yes. Instead, we made a decision, actually, we wanted a strong and united Europe and wanted to foster European integration, and we welcomed a unified Germany that would make it stronger still. Now, I can make an argument why that's in our interest too. And actually, at the time, I did make such an argument. So rather than rehash my argument and say, you make these arguments and different people find them persuasive. In some cases, I actually don't know why people, choose one interest argument versus another interest argument, because a lot of this is not like an objective answer. If only you had the right formula, you would know objectively what our interests always are. There are some extent to which interests are formed by brute facts, but I think actually a large part of interests are actually subjective beliefs about the meanings of facts. And that's, I think, very much true in this case. And so I think actually the issues of passion and reason actually play a very important role in kind of the kinds of outcomes with which people just feel more comfortable, that seem to play better for them, but seem to play the difference in between Bush and Scowcroft. So rather than give you a more formal interest-based answer, a more wonkish answer, I kind of want to fall back on, because you can actually write that answer in a way for yourself, because I don't think that helps you very much. I think instead I want to just make the point that the interest arguments can be formulated in so many different ways that focusing primarily on the interest arguments misses a lot of what's underneath the shell.
Yeah. Lord Pole, did you have a comment?
Well, I don't want to be selfish, I might say last night, but if I could just pick up on 2 or 3 points anyway, and add a little local colour, perhaps. I thought Phil gave us a real tour de force, I must say, and so is his article in Foreign Affairs, and if you haven't read it, you certainly should, and Phil, that'll be $5, thank you. First of all, make me feel what it would have been like if Helmut Schmidt had been involved. Well, I think what would be clear is the whole issue would have depended on the economics of it, in which case it would never have got done, because the economics made no sense at all. And, luckily, Helmut Kohl completely ignored economics in every decision he took. So that's very, very simple.
That's true, yeah.
Secondly, on the point of borders, it was actually a very live issue, particularly between Margaret Thatcher and President Mitterrand. And Margaret Thatcher, from somewhere, had acquired a map which showed the borders of Germany at different stages in its history. And to say what really the Germans were a people in constant flux, whose borders have moved east and west at different times. This damn map gave me more trouble than anything else. I don't know where she got it. At the end of the discussion, it disappeared into her handbag, and having to raid her handbag was worse than the sort of Dieppe landings in World War II. It was a very difficult operation. I did finally get it and destroy it, but to my rage, she just produced another copy of it. So this went on for quite a while. But, certainly more seriously, the issue of 1988 versus 1989, I feel is absolutely right historically, but I think you would have to say that there was an element of, as it were, flattering President Reagan. This was his last year, he was going out of office, he had won the Cold War. I don't think, honestly, we did think the Cold War had ended in 1988, and I say that really because when Margaret Thatcher came to office, her first sort of 4 or 5 years were devoted to supporting President Reagan on the evil empire and how terrible the Soviet Union is and so on. In 1984, we held a seminar with a lot of academics, really to try to devise a strategy going forward. And it had 2 elements. One was to try to make some sort of contact with the next generation of Soviet leaders. And the result of that seminar, we fired off into the blue 3 invitations. One was to Gorbachev, one was to Romanov, and one was to Grishin. At that stage, all names to conjure with. 2 of them, of course, have disappeared from history completely. And it was quite by chance that Gorbachev was the one who accepted the invitation and came to Britain in '84. But the second element of the strategy was to try to build contacts with Eastern Europe, to start to coax them out, to take a few little risks in their relations with the Soviet Union. And we started with Hungary and went there in '84, and then a bit later to Poland, and a little bit later still to Czechoslovakia. And what I'm trying to say by this is that the strategy of ending the Cold War could really only be complete when those East European countries had really come out and were going to achieve their freedom. And we couldn't really have conceived of an end to the Cold War before that had happened. My third point was, I think we all took a more political view of the German drive to unification. I think we thought Chancellor Kohl had a very strong party political interest in getting this done and getting it done quickly. And I would have put, I think somebody else said that, and I agree with the point. Maybe it was you, Marcus, actually. I think that's absolutely right. At least from the European perspective, Kohl was the arch politician. I mean, I've never come across a man more political and more successfully political. I'm not criticizing it, I'm just stating it as a fact. And I would have put much greater weight on his party political interest in grabbing this chance, running with it, and getting the touchdown quickly before anyone could possibly block him. My next point was going to be one you've already made, actually, Phil. You guys took a colossal gamble. I mean, you made Las Vegas look tame. And you didn't really just gamble on Gorbachev. I agree with you, at the end of the day, none of us was paid to look after Mr. Gorbachev's political prospects. That was his job. But what you were gambling with was the whole freedom of Eastern Europe. It wasn't just Germany, it was really those other countries. It was Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, it was the Baltic states. If this had gone wrong, that was another 10 years probably for them of the nightmarish situation that they faced. So I think it's only right to recognise that it was a gamble. It was a very successful gamble, and of course, the winner takes all in this game, and you're fully entitled to do that. But I think one should always remember what a gamble it was. Next, I think you do take a very and quite naturally take a very US-centric view of this. In Europe, I think we looked at it in very much more European terms. Just to give you two thoughts about that. One, in Britain, we perceived the arrival of George H.W. Bush, Jim and yourself and others, as coming in with an agenda to tip the balance very much more towards mainland continental Europe. In crude terms, the reasoning seemed to be that under Reagan, Margaret Thatcher only had to pick up the telephone, and Reagan would constantly upend any advice received from the State Department and the NSC and do what she wanted. It was a bit of an exaggeration, but it had an element of truth in it, and very convenient it was. We saw you coming in to put that right, and that therefore the whole approach to German unification was to build up the relationship with Germany particularly, to some degree with France, but Germany particularly, to counterbalance excessive UK influence in Washington, which had gone before. Now, I remember being a naive young man being quite sort of worried about that, and going to talk to Margaret Thatcher about it and saying, look, this seems to me what they're doing, and perhaps we better worry. And she said, Charles, don't worry about it. It won't take them long to discover who their true friends are. And of course she then felt justified when we had Iraq and Kuwait and who was there to fight alongside the United States and so on, but the UK. And I just tell you that to give you an additional perspective on it. And I will shut up very quickly. Perhaps just 2 points. Gorbachev, why did he allow this to happen? I think that's one of the most interesting questions of the whole of this affair. And Margaret Thatcher had 7 long meetings with Gorbachev between 84 and 89, and I was present at all of them. In fact, I was the only other person present at them on the UK side, and they were a wonder to behold. I have a particular memory of one where she had invited Gorbachev to Britain, and they sat down to talk, and she spoke uninterruptedly for 20 minutes, after which I took my courage in my hands and passed her a little note which read, Prime Minister, you're talking too much. And without drawing breath, she reached into her handbag, got out her pen, and wrote something on it and handed it back to me, and it said, I know. If ever there was a put down, that was it. But I think Gorbachev was consciously a very different person and wanted to show he was a very different person to any previous Soviet leaders. Now, I absolutely agree with Phil. He was in many ways, he was the sort of Boy Scout model young communist. He had built his reputation in, I think it was Stavropol, wasn't it, where he had constantly welcomed all the aged Soviet leaders coming to take the waters and whatever, and he met them at the airport or the train station, he drove them there. Oh my God, he was a greasy old so-and-so, and he really sort of built his reputation there. But actually, underneath that, a very different man was there. And one particular little episode sticks in my memory. When we were in Moscow, and he'd given Margaret Thatcher dinner in some old sugar baron's palace that he had commandeered. And after dinner, we were sitting around a large fire and just sort of talking away. And they got in a discussion of socialism, Margaret Thatcher's favourite subject, as you can imagine. And Gorbachev referred to the working class. And Margaret Thatcher said, look, that's old-style thinking. I mean, who are the working class? And Gorbachev said, well, I am. And Mrs. Gorbachev said, no, we're not. We're middle class. And that really, I thought, was very, it showed an entirely different mindset. And I think this middle class values would never have allowed them to do the sort of thing which the Soviet Union did in Hungary and East Germany and so on. So he was a very different person. And absolutely last of all, just as a little bit of interest, that some things never change. The Singapore government, the week after next, is organising, during the APEC ministerial meeting, what was going to be a celebration of 20 years from the fall of the wall. They've got a large piece of the wall, and Bob Zellick and I were going to debate the very things we've been discussing here. The Chinese have vetoed this. They think it's totally inappropriate to celebrate the fall of the wall in Asia, and the subject of the debate has to be changed to something like the impact of the end of the Cold War on international structures. Now, I'm not going to say anything different, but it's interesting the Chinese still cannot accept that the fall of the wall was something which should cause universal rejoicing.
Yes.
Dr. Zelko, did you want to respond to any of this?
Just one comment that was splendid. Actually, several things in there that really helped me a lot. just kind of on the on Charles's last point on Gorbachev showing he was a very different person. I want to put it in terms even blunter than Charles used, because what this really came down to is: are you willing to kill people for this? Just let's strip all the veneer off this. And the Chinese were willing to kill hundreds of people in order to do what they thought needed to be done. It takes a certain sort of personality and a certain sort of beliefs to be willing to kill people for those beliefs. If you just look, in the East German government, the top, like Erich Mielke, these were people, he was very old by that time. These were people who had a lot of blood on their hands. They'd been responsible for killing a lot of people. Mielke goes back to the Spanish Civil War, where they were killing their communist comrades, much less the nominal enemy. And when he'd been working for the Comintern back in those days. But of course he's in his late 80s by then. A little of the energy and vigor is drained away. The younger generation thought they didn't want to have to kill people for their beliefs. They didn't grow up believing that in the same ways that, well, we're revolutionaries, and usually people aren't going to understand where the world needs to go, and the ones who don't understand and who are obstinate enough will have to be killed. You have to grow up in a certain milieu and in a certain generation to believe that, and something had happened there. And in some ways why the most prescient thing ever written anticipating the end of the Cold War was written actually by an English columnist named Bernard Levin. He wrote it in 1977. He actually called the date as July '89. Now Levin was discounted at the time because he was a kind of a reflexive anti-communist, and so he had one more piece. But it's not so much that Levin said it will die. That's not what's notable about it. It's his reasoning for it that's interesting in the piece. This piece he had in, I think it was the Times in 1977. And Levin's argument was, he noticed some particular permutation that was going on in maybe, I think, Czechoslovakia at the time. He says, I think that inside some of these young communists that are coming up now, he says, you can't see it, but there is, the revolution will be led by someone who looks like a perfectly model communist leader, but who inside has actually come to no longer believe in the system. And the extreme form of testing whether or not you believe enough in the system is, will you kill people to preserve it?
Professor Quint, did you have a...
I wanted to. Philip Zelikow referred to the protests and the crisis at the time of the Euro missiles in the late 70s and I guess early 80s, and I suppose we could say that this was the great European event of that period, a period not very far removed from German unification and the end of the Cold War, and I wanted to get your views on the relationship between these two events. I've heard it argued that the firmness and determination of the West against the considerable internal opposition, particularly in Germany, but in Europe in general, against the stationing of these Pershing II missiles, played a role in the willingness at the end of the Soviet Union to make concessions. Perhaps this could be put in terms, if one buys this argument, of contributing to the strategic initiative, as you put it, of the West at the time of German unification at the end of the Cold War. On the other hand, I believe that Gorbachev has written in his memoirs, or somewhere, that the opposition to the Euro missiles gave a certain amount of encouragement to him and others in the Soviet Union that they have friends in the West, and perhaps, to put it in Margaret Thatcher's terms, ultimately business could be done. So I'd be very much interested in hearing your views on this.
Well, I don't think the fight over the Euro missiles would have encouraged Gorbachev to think Margaret Thatcher is a secret ally, given Thatcher's role in that particular debate. What I do think, and I don't remember that passage in his book, but I do think Gorbachev was very impressed with the emergence of European socialism and all the intellectual movements going on inside European socialism. And so as I tried to answer that why question earlier, and then you have to kind of look at the origins of Gorbachev's beliefs that basically a Marxism could successfully be revised into this more revisionist format. And you look at from whom is he drawing inspiration and evidence for that belief. I think partly there are some Soviet communist ideologues from the early days, and Stephen Cohen has written a little bit about this. But I think partly it's from some of the French and Italian and Spanish communists of that particular day, communists and socialists. And maybe he was drawing some inspiration from the rallying of those forces and seeing them as inspirational to show that there was still a really powerful, viable presence for the left in European politics. And his side, his would have a differing social system that would epitomize the way the left could succeed in the common European home, while then there might be another social system in the West that was still discovering how to have try to get on the path to socialism. I think this is the way he might have thought of these ideals in 1988, is we need to perfect socialism by changing it and revitalizing it in these different ways. And then we can posture ourselves as saying we've actually found a better balance of the role of the state in our form of socialism. And in a way, you folks may now be on the road to join us now that we've worked out the right balance.
Please join me in thanking our panelists and questioners. It was a very enjoyable morning. We'll now move to lunch, which will be served outside here.